This is the second week for our series on the Holy Club. Last week we began by talking about John Wesley and his group of students at Oxford when he was there, that started coming together as a way to encourage one another in their lives of faith. They adopted a method, and that's the way they were going to live out their discipleship. And then this club would eventually turn into the class meetings and the societies that would fuel the revival that would take place not only in England, but would extend into the Americas and around the world. And I want to take a moment for you to picture in these groups. Remember, we talked about last week how they would inquire of one another, and they would ask questions like, how is it with your soul? And when we look at some traditions, especially those that practice confession in the church, sometimes we're very uncomfortable with that. We don't want to air our dirty laundry, or we don't want people to know about what's going on with our lives. But I want you to picture that in these groups that would come together, that could be up to about a dozen people, they would ask each other those questions, not behind a curtain and not in privacy, but outwardly in the open, in the confines of that group. What are the sins that you are struggling with this week? How is it that we can keep you from committing those sins? How can we help to encourage you to be faithful? So it was a very different model that called people to account for the way they were walking in their lives of faith. But I want you to recognize, too, that this holy club that Wesley had, it wasn't the only type of club in the area that was trying to spread holiness. In fact, there were movements throughout in this time period, like this group called the Society for the Reformation of Manners. Now, doesn't that just sound like they're going to teach you how to do high tea the right way? They're going to tell you which fork to use. But we're going to look at today the intersection of those, because in 1763, in January, John Wesley actually presented a sermon before one of these societies for the Reformation of Manners. So I want you to come back here to Psalm 94 that we just heard Gabe read a part of for us. Because in this psalm, we hear about a God who avenges the righteous. God is ultimately going to be our judge and the judge of all the world. Now, I'm not going to get too far into that. That's going to be the topic of the sermon for next week. But our Lord as God knows our thoughts, knows our actions, knows everything from within us, and also is a God who brings us discipline and instruction. When we learn from and we grow from discipline, we begin to experience God's goodness in a way that calls us to stand against sin and wickedness that take place, that we see around us. I want you to think about that. When we see evil in the world, what do we want to do? Naturally, we want to insulate ourselves from it, right? We want to avoid it. We want it not to creep into the lives that we've created. We want it not to disrupt our comfort. But we hear here in the good news in the psalm, it says, "Who rises up for me against the wicked? Who stands up for me against evildoers? When I thought my foot is slipping, your steadfast love, O Lord, held me up. When the cares of my heart are many, your consolations cheer my soul." We don't fight our battles alone, but we have this God who we turn to be our rock and our strength. And it's the Lord who's eventually going to wipe out all of those who have been arrogant and hurtful toward us. Now, the psalm, though, also talks about groups of people that band together for the purposes of doing what is evil in the world. Now, we don't have to look far for examples of groups like that, do we? Now, how many of you watched the opening ceremonies for the Winter Olympics? I love the Winter Olympics, don't you? I just, being half Canadian and half American, I've got lots of athletes to root for, and it's always just an exciting time around our house. The kids are trying to build a bobsled track in the driveway, which is scary. At least they wear helmets, but it brings together this sense of camaraderie and celebration around the world. And one of the things I noticed in that opening ceremony was that there's always a symbolic artistic piece referencing the dove of peace. We saw it after they raised the flag. There was this beautiful dance with the Russian ballerinas that created this dove. And that's an element that they incorporate into every opening ceremonies because they want it to be a moment of peace around the world. But think about it. If we look at the news, what groups do we hear about in reference to the Olympics? It's not so much all the athletes, but it's really the concern for what terrorists are going to strike. Who's going to be harming people? What are the plans, the contingency plans we have to have in place for when the inevitable horrible thing happens? And isn't that a shame? That there are groups in this world who look toward the world stage like this for opportunities to exact harm. And that's what God is talking about. That's what the psalmist is talking about. There are these groups out there that exist and band together for evil. But just as the wicked come together to scheme and inflict pain and conflict, Wesley modeled the importance that people also need to come together for the purposes of doing good and serving others. And that's why this Sunday we're actually celebrating Scout Sunday. And Scouts, I think, is one of those wonderful examples of a group that is formed for the purpose of teaching our young people how to make ethical and moral decisions. It teaches them the important concepts of reverence and thriftiness and brotherhood and sisterhood and sharing goodwill to people, not just in their troop, but around the world. And so for a moment, I want our Scouts that are with us today to stand to be recognized. We have Gabe here, who's a Cub Scout, and we have Elizabeth, who's a Daisy, and then we have Maddie, who's also a Daisy Scout. So they are starting their journey. Let's give them a round of applause. And you all can sit down now. We're thankful today to have you here worshiping with us, because to be a Scout, worshiping God, to serve God and your country, and to help others is an important element. How many of you grown-ups were Scouts? How many of you were Boy Scouts? How many of you were Girl Scouts? I'm a Brownie dropout, so I'll raise my hand for that year and a half. How many do we have anybody who was a Sea Scout? All right, we have one Sea Scout over there. Anybody that did Venture Crew? Any Queen Scouts? No Canadians here? Okay, it's the same thing. But anyway, how many of you got kicked out of Scouts? Yeah, a lot of people get kicked out of Scouts too. My father-in-law started a fire, and that's why he got kicked out of Scouts. But anyway, but these groups, they teach values that are good and important. And they mirror what we want the best of our children to be and the best of our societies to be. People who are self-sufficient and are able to perform different things, and, how can you survive when you don't have electricity? Well, Scouts teaches you that. And the church is also designed to work in tandem with those kinds of values that express an even broader mission. Now, here's the mission of the church as Wesley puts it in this sermon. He says that we are to compact together to save each soul, assist each other, overturn Satan, and set up the kingdom of Christ. That's a short order, isn't it? But that's what we're to be about. saving souls, assisting each other, overturning Satan, and setting up the kingdom of Christ. In his own church in England, Wesley, he asked if everybody was engaged in this kind of work. And he looked around, especially when it came to opposing evil in the world. He remarked, "I fear the greater part of them are themselves the world." And wasn't that a shame? As he looked at his church, he couldn't find examples of people who were truly living up to this gospel standard. He said, remember, the key is that people are to be somehow different when we conduct ourselves in the world. There's something that should be different about us, something that sets us apart other than the fact that we gather on Sunday mornings. So this little group of Methodists that were known to be enthusiastic and fanatics, they were sneered at by the larger church. All of these people who were very cold to them. It was said, though, at that time, it was even said this, listen to this quote, "I have never met a clergyman who was religious." Yeah. It was an age of skepticism and religious apathy, particularly in upper classes and educated people. They were skeptical about the church. They were skeptical about religion. They couldn't see within the very institution this model that Wesley was putting forward of saving souls, of assisting one another, overturning Satan, and setting up the kingdom of Christ. And there was a very popular writer of the time named Philip Doddridge. He called these people nominal Christians. That is, they take the name Christian because they're not anything else, but they don't live a life that's rooted in the gospel. A nominal Christian is someone who says they're Christian, but yet they have nothing else in their lives that reflect that. And this is the mid-1700s when they're talking about this, but I tell you, this is a term we throw around in church circles all the time now, the nominal Christian. It's something that hasn't gone away, but in fact has just overflowed. It's grown exponentially how many people would fit into this category. It reminds me of one of the youth in a church that I served early on. I have never had this experience before, but you know how sometimes there are those kids that given the day, you either want to hug them, love them, or you want to strangle them. You know how it is. I had this one particular youth who, he was the kind of kid who you always had to have a plan of action for to keep him on task, but yet when we had our mission trip and the person whose house we were working on said, "Why are you doing this?" He's the one that said, "Because we're Christians." That warmed my heart kind of moment. And I hold on to that. But this particular young man, he had me write his letter of recommendation to become an Eagle Scout. And I was very proud to do that because, I'm proud of that mission trip moment, and I thought he's on the right path. And I kid you not, it was like a month after the Court of Honor when he received that award, he came to me and said, "Melissa, can you help me do some community service hours?" He'd been picked up for some petty crime. And I'm like, are you kidding me? He just turned 18 years old, like the month before, and he's got this crime on his record. This is my Eagle Scout. This is the one I'm holding up as my heart, saying, look, the gospel is transforming him, and then he's doing stupid stuff. It broke my heart, and there was just this disconnect between who he told the world he was through participation in scouting and being this example of the kind of young man everybody should be, but at the same time, his actions weren't reflecting that at all. His actions were not in line with who he was professing to be. Doddridge said, "Moral men are guilty before God. that if the present world is their sole preoccupation, they are neglecting vital religion. That true religion is, and get this is what true religion is, an all-absorbing sense of God's presence and love, which has a profound impact upon the total direction of a person's life. Religion, you hear that, is not about keeping a system of rules and saying the right things and doing the right things. True religion is to know the all-encompassing presence and love of God in your life for you in a way that will transform. That you are changed from the inside out because of that. That's what we want to have, to know God's love. This awareness was about paying attention to all the small things, the way that God would work within people. And then on the flip side, the Society for the Reformation of Manners, they said what we're going to do is we're going to begin attacking evil by looking at the small things. And it's important to do that because that's how you break a cycle of sin. It's when you stop the petty crime that you keep someone from sliding into something more heinous that may lead to the death penalty. And so in this sermon, you'll actually see, let me find the right page. If you take time to look through this, there's actually in here. The way that the Society for the Reformation of Manners would work, this is on page 3. They worked with the constables and the magistrates and the other authorities in the town because they wanted to actually have people convicted for what they were doing, particularly when it came to not observing the Sabbath. That was an issue that they had. But you'll see a list of some of the crimes that people committed, like unlawful gaming and profane swearing. You know, for people who didn't keep the Sabbath, keepers of ill houses. They even went after bakers. The bakers were their least resistant group because they said, okay, we would like to take a day off. But they believed that if they could work to get people to quit doing things like buying and selling and drinking and cursing and going to these houses of ill repute and gambling, if they could bring these crimes to justice, it was going to begin to create a more holy environment in their community. And within 5 years, they'd brought over nearly 10,000 people to justice through this plan. It was the small things. But Wesley counters that as he's preaching to them, because he says, while what they're doing is honorable and commendable, the numbers and statistics show good work, but it's still the wrong approach. And this is what John Wesley said: "But if the end you aim at really be to reform sinners, you choose the wrong means. It is the Word of God that must affect this and not human laws. It is the work of ministers, not of magistrates, because it makes no change of heart." Because he recognized if you picked people up for these things, they might be back to doing it, or, at worst, people were going to continue to commit these small crimes. But at the very best, they would also become hypocrites because they would pretend to be what they weren't. Because there wasn't that change from within, that sense of what? The all-absorbing presence of God, sense of God's presence and love that would change the total direction of a purpose of a person's life. That's what we're going to keep coming back to, that refrain. For Wesley, if you wanted a change of behavior in somebody, you had to be willing to go to them as a sister or a brother and speak the truth in love. It wasn't enough just to have the constable pick them up. You needed to go to them. And he said to be like a surgeon about it, not like a butcher or a hangman. He said, put the patient to no more pain than necessary. Don't be pleased with yourself that you've caught someone being bad and turn them into the authorities. Instead, be sad. Show the other that you pity where they are. Sympathize and be calm and mild, and observe your own motives. Do it to the Lord as the servants of Christ. This is the more excellent way that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13, that love that is patient and kind. It's loving your friends and your enemies. We're to love our neighbors as ourselves and be ready to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. See, these societies for the reformation of manners, they only lasted a few years. Eventually, a costly verdict from the king's bench brought them down. It bankrupted the work they were trying to do. But this model of attacking evil and wrong by going to the source early, by actually speaking the truth in love, those are methods that could benefit all of us. Otherwise, we fall into the very same traps of being nominal Christians, unconcerned with the real heart change that comes from that all-absorbing sense of what? The presence of God's love. Think about the little sins in yourself that you ignore all the time, and those of others that you just let slide. Maybe you gossip to somebody about another's behavior. Maybe you look at them and you hang your mouth open and say, I cannot believe they would do such a thing. We say, I'll just keep my mouth shut and mind my own business. But it's not love if we leave someone in their sin. It isn't love if we hope that the situation is somehow going to resolve itself. It isn't sisterhood or brotherhood to turn a blind eye when our friend or even our enemy is in need of our care and concern. So we often complain about what our society is becoming. It's not so much about buying and selling and baking on Sunday anymore. In fact, I'm sure I'll see you all at Walmart after church today, right? And I know that because I'm there too. But think of all the other changes in our world we complain about. Pastor John was saying, for what it's worth, when the blue laws ended, there was something that was taken away because families couldn't just be together and observe a Sabbath. They couldn't just enjoy each other's company. But think about it, are we falling in line with the ways of the world, or are we willing to speak the truth in love in a way that's actually going to reform the culture around us? Are we Christians in name only, or do we have the all-absorbing sense of God's presence and love that changes the direction of our lives? No matter where you go, no matter what you do, that is what you need, to know that presence of God in your life. Because that, and only that, is what's going to transform you. And the beautiful thing about this gospel message, the beautiful thing about Jesus Christ and all that he did for us, is that this is the gift that is given to every single one of us. Every day we have the chance to receive this blessing and to be transformed by it. And we don't need some group to tell us how we are to conduct ourselves. And we don't come to God, loving God, because we're afraid of damnation and what's going to happen to us in the hereafter. But we come to know this God that loves, because that is who God is by his nature. So have that all-absorbing sense of God's presence and love that will change the direction of your life. Amen.